Welcome to the first episode of Inside Multifamily Access Control. Very excited today. It's brought to you by Salto Systems. It's a show where Colin and myself, who you'll meet right after this, we really dig into access control in the multifamily marketplace. And we have a conversation, hopefully bring a little bit of thought leadership, maybe just throw some discussions and ideas around strategy in ways that, we can sort of move the conversation along around the access control marketplace and multifamily. So with that, we'll kick off number one. How you doing, Colin?
Well, thanks. Good to see you again.
You as well. So let's take the first topic for week one. It's the question and I guess the statement around how to say yes without worrying. There was Parks Associates had a seminar and a webinar a couple weeks ago. And there was a gentleman from Mill Creek that was on, and he made a statement around this idea of making a purchasing decision, more or less, and not having to worry, which we all know within the access control industry, fortunately, unfortunately, that is a thing. So with that, I thought maybe what we do is we'll talk about what sort of things people are worrying about and ways that we can mitigate it. And maybe in some of them, even just have a reality conversation of like, you know what, it is what it is, but we're working through it. So with that, Colin, what do you think are the things that if I'm a developer, owner, property manager, what am I worried about when it comes to access control?
Yeah, a good question. I think there's a number of things that factor into that or cause some of that worry. Starting with some of it is the development timeline, right? And on that same Parks Associates conversation, it was talking about the 3 to 5 year timeline, right? So what is relevant today when we're making some of these decisions on access control? Is it going to be relevant in 3 to 5 years when this project is complete? So certainly that timeline is a factor in that. Another one is the demand for integration, right? I'll call it integration, but really it's this demand that's coming for IoT involvement. So all of the other things that are going to be on the property, whether it's a community engagement application platform or a in-unit, in-resident platform, how is the access control system going to work with that? How do you get these systems and these different platforms all working together? And then I think probably the most, the biggest one is the resident adoption, right? If you're going to make this investment into access control, both at the unit level and for your common area doors, is the resident going to adopt it? Are they going to use it? Is it going to provide the services and the flexibility and meet the demands of the residents? So I think those are probably the big three that I would think would keep people up at night for the development process.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are definitely three that are important. And again, there's probably, hundreds of things, right? So some that are not even related to anything on the access control side. They happen to be just a product of the development. But so let's break each of those down just a little bit more. So if we talk about the outdated one, which before this, you and I wrote down what I thought were four, and that was actually top of my list, was this idea that by the time they purchase the product, it's already outdated, and this issue that they want to be able to say yes down the road. So if we take a look at that, and I think that's a technology concern regardless. You have that if you're buying a phone, you're buying whatever, right? So it's just the nature of how technology works, but there are ways to maybe take some of that and put it to ease. So offhand, what are some thoughts that you have around what are ways that companies like Salto and others that are approaching this to make it not an issue?
Yeah, I think the technology is the key there, right? Are we building the technology to be adaptive, right? And future flexible, I think, is another term that's been started to use, right? It's hard to future proof, but you can become future flexible. And how do you build your technology that enables you to update and add those features and leverage new features and leverage new technology as it becomes available? And so I think one of the big things is how do you do that with a platform versus hardware, right? It's a lot easier to update software and update a platform than it is to update hardware, really. So how do you get that hardware and software to work together in a way that you can provide those added features or added functions as they become available to ensure that you don't become outdated. So I think you always have to build that technology now with the 3 years in really in the 5 years or 10 years into the future that you can add those features via updates, whether it's firmware updates, software updates, whatever it is. And then I think the other piece that's making that more reality is the cloud, right? Obviously, as stuff shifts to the cloud, the updates, the feature adds, those things become easier because you don't necessarily have to get to every single device point and stuff like that. So there's a lot of opportunities to make sure you stay flexible and on that leading edge, but you have to be building with that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's the main critical part because you think historically how locks were built, they were basically, you built it once, you installed it and it was done. You didn't have to worry about future updating on that end. And I would say our industry trails a lot of times when it comes to the technology adoptions. Now, it's getting better than it has been before, but really the use cases of how we built it before were not with really this idea of massive integrations. And frankly, it wasn't a lot of rip and replace that was done. You put the stuff in, it was there for 30 some years, right? So now this expectation, the consumerization of how products work, the flexibility, I really like the future flexible side. That's a way to look at it, I think. The other side of it is that it's not just about motorization anymore, like you said. That's an important part, but it's also about what the products can do within an ecosystem. So making sure you have it. And I think, for the developers and property managers that listen to this, I think one of the key aspects is to really make that a specification and ask your partners. It's not just about the fire rating anymore, but asking them, from the specification standpoint, how do they handle integrations and how do they handle the being flexible for the future? So it's an important question that doesn't always show up, on a bid sheet, if you would. But it's definitely a specification that you can tell people are going to start asking more about. So the last thing I would say is, and I would agree with you too, the purposefulness of the development of it's not just a part that you plug in. It's a philosophy when you're building these locks that you actually, maybe in the development of it, make some sacrifices to other areas to prioritize this because it's such a problem or an opportunity, depending on which way you look at things, and to approach it with that. So having the conversation, asking the questions, having just a meeting maybe or have them write something that's like, how do you make your products future flexible? I think you'll learn a lot about a company by just asking that. It's a great point. The next point that you brought up was the sort of demand for integration, which the IoT involvement, which again, there too, I would agree with you. It kind of comes down to the purposefulness of the building it to do that as well, and the priorities. Where before, again, our industry was predicated off of security, of keeping bad people out, and not necessarily on the convenience side of what it would do and added value everywhere else that you talked about. Whereas now the use cases have changed where you can have both security and convenience. And this idea of the demand of it to work. The other part around that is, and I'm wondering, this sort of utopia is standards, right? How things are going to go. But the realities that we know is that the chances of that happening anytime soon are slim to both you and I may be retired by then. So, worrying about that currently now, I think it's something to pay attention to, but it's not necessarily something that I would bank, the development to happening today. So this idea. And then the last one is the residence adoption. So I put on here on my list, if you would, which I think goes along with it, not only just with the resident do it, but it's the idea of a consistent experience as well to drive that adoption. Because I believe if the resident can't get in the door the first time they try to use their mobile device, they're going to say, just give me a key. And we're going to go backwards because the consistency wasn't necessarily there for the experience to happen. And it's so important to have that. So that goes back into also how the product's development. So maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of from a lock point of view and in the development side, when you look at those things, like when it comes to consistency and then also purpose-built products, how do you see that happen where you're at? And then, so to give sort of our listeners, if you would, an idea of how you all approach it, we give them an idea of how to think about it as well.
I think that's something that as a industry, right, we're struggling with that because I think the easy answer to that in the past was, hey, the user comes up and they get locked out, right? In the past, the answer from the lock side was, that's good. That means our fail safe was working, right?
Oh, that's so scary. But yes, that is true.
right? I mean, that was success in the past and as a security organization, right? And now we have to challenge ourselves as manufacturers, as integrators, on that security versus convenience. What becomes success in that, right? And so it really becomes imperative that we understand operationally how these end users, how these residents want and expect this lock to function, and then what the demands of these multifamily developers and owners and operators are for what they envision that experience for their users to be like. And then we really have to build our products to that, right? Because it isn't just about security anymore. The convenience it's not equal to it, right? It still is about keeping the bad people out and making sure the people who have access get into it. But when a user has that initial experience of the lock didn't work, that is a big red flag now. And we can't just say, that's okay, that's security in doing what it needs to do. You've now got to call the maintenance person to come let you in, verify. No, we can't have that. So the way we build our products, both on the hardware side as it relates to fail safe, fail secure, whatever you want it to be, is just as important as how do we build that on the software side. How do you give access? How do you grant access? What happens when the connectivity goes down? I think that's a major one, right? I think every sales rep in our organization certainly comes across that conversation. What happens when we lose connectivity?
Yeah.
How do we handle that? How do we handle access when a database can't be accessed, or when a controller doesn't know what the latest database update is? When connectivity becomes such a major factor, how do you handle that? We leverage it in a couple of different ways, depending on which platform of ours you're using, but that's become a major factor in the product build out and in the product specification on our side. So you're definitely seeing a transition from it used to be an easy answer, right? How do you want this to function? The most secure way, right? That as an easy answer. Now it can't be the only answer. We have to really understand the use case, understand the demands, understand what the user experience is going to be, understand what the owner expects to happen in that case, and then build a product that we can deliver in that.
Yeah, so I've seen it in a couple of ways and agree 100% with you on that side. So it's this idea we've been talking about, moving from access control to access care, this idea. And then I think the second part being the end user historically has never really been someone that, frankly, our industry had to worry about, right? It was, they got a key or a card, and then they had a reader on the lock or a keyway, and that's how they got in. And then now, though, because of mobile and the rest of it, you're starting, and then with the integrations, it's a lot of that's done outside of the maintenance side, it's done for the end user. So this new client that we have, if you would, stakeholder that we have to worry about and design for, I think you can definitely see when someone has put that person into consideration when they're building a lock, which is also interesting because a lot of times our locks were built for, the past 30 years, they didn't change very much. So we didn't have to worry about the end user. Now we have to. And I think a great example of that was like the conversations that people have around whether you have a keyway or not, right? And that to me is a good example of sort of the design process of asking the question of like, what could go wrong? And then kind of going through that process versus the whiz bang fun part of, like the cool factor stuff. But it's also asking that question of what could go wrong. And so again, I think another good best practice would be is ask people within the business, have you thought about what could go wrong? And if you have, help me as a developer, product property manager understand what are the things that could go wrong, so that I'm prepared for them, and have some of these things mitigated in the process would be a good process, I think, for some of these people to do. So yeah, so if we're to look at that, so what could go wrong, and if we're to take a look at like how not to worry, right? So the three that you had was ways to make sure the products don't get outdated. There's a way to do that when it comes to the software. The demand for integrations, and that's what's driving a lot of that. And then there was resident adoption. So those three are big main drivers. There's also, I think, if I can, I'll just expand on a couple others that I was thinking about and get your quick thoughts on these. We don't have to necessarily dive into them. We can do maybe we'll do it in an article. But number one, I think installation of it is also a big one, right? Like, it's one thing to select the product, and there's the worry of like, oh, great, now I have to deal with it being installed. Second is cost associated to it. There seems to be an expectation or a belief that it's going to be cumbersome, when I think there are some ways that we've seen people try to take an approach to make it, OpEx to CapEx and things like that. And then I guess the last one actually we talked about was consistency. So I only had two that I added, was the install and cost of being the others. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the installation piece is huge, and a lot of that actually I think kind of combines with that demand for integration with other IoT solutions and other platforms, right? Because that just adds a level of complexity to that installation. Now, how do you find an integrator that can maybe operate in 2 or 3 different platforms and bring them together? Versus kind of project managing 3 different integration aspects. So I think that adds the complexity to it. You also are starting to see the demand of that hardware, right? The traditional door hardware installation piece. Well, now it's not just a hardware installation. Now there's hardware with the software side of it. So making, as a manufacturer, we spend a lot of time with our integration partners and our business partners on making sure they're trained on both the hardware and the software side of it. And so there's a lot that needs to go into that from a training and a background, because of that there is added complexity as soon as we get to that stage. So I think that installation piece needs to be factored in, but a lot of it comes back to that training and that involvement.
Yeah, on that, if I could, are you seeing people write specifications that address certain certifications or trainings? And the reason why I ask is, I remember from my lighting control days, on especially larger projects, they would have a specification written on certain training levels or certifications that an installer would have to be able to even bid on the project. Are you seeing that type of stuff go through, or is it just a common practice that most of the time the people that show up to the job already have it, so there's no reason to separate that?
Yeah, not really seeing a specific certification that we're coming across, but definitely seeing, must work with or must integrate with, and you are starting to see some of that language come in. But I'm not seeing a ton of the specific certification requirements. Now I don't in my role, I don't look at a ton of specifications. A lot of that's handled in more of the project level stuff. So I should probably go and check on that, but I have not seen a ton of that.
No, this makes sense. I just wonder, as these jobs get more complex,
Yeah.
and you do have the software and the hardware side, whether we start to see a separation of, at least we did, like in the lighting control side, we saw a separation at some point of people that did the installation, then some people did programming, and then some
Yeah.
people did programming and installation.
Yeah.
That you may start to see that also happen here as the adoption gets greater. So I guess it's probably something just to keep an eye out.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, for topic one, I think that's great. So reasons why people can, purchase and then feel okay and not have to worry on it. Make sure the products have something built in to make sure they're not outdated the second you have it. So asking questions around that, the demand for integration, driving to understand how integrations are handled and the added value that goes there. And then the adoption side of the resident around consistency, but then also just the making sure you have the right feature sets to make sure that they have the things that they want. So I love that. Actually, if I could ask you one question on some recent news.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
All right. So I know we both saw in the news today, Google put a bunch of money into ADT, and frankly, I think it's like 6.6% of the organization, and they got a whole bunch of marketing in that. And what I found interesting was the press release that went out. It didn't even have anybody from ADT talking in it. It was the quote from Google, which Nest side, which tells me that it's an initiative that's being driven by Google and Nest because they usually like to control that type of stuff when the message goes out. And then I saw a bunch of comments from the ADT side on LinkedIn and the rest. But wanted to get your impressions. What do you think this means to the multifamily space, or do you think this is primarily a consumer-driven type program and a resident? What are your thoughts around it?
No, I think it definitely is going to impact the multifamily space. I think it's a big sign. A lot of conversation has been around kind of the security integration piece becoming more of the mainstream with some of these larger companies, and I think this speaks to it. Well, yeah, I think the base play of it is certainly more aimed at kind of the traditional single family home space. But I also know ADT's multifamily group is growing big time also, and so this will certainly factor into that. Obviously, in the multifamily space, as I've attended some of these different conferences, that voice assistant is becoming a bigger and bigger aspect of everything that happens in some of these connected multifamily spaces. And obviously Nest recognizes that also, right? I mean, Google and those guys are monitoring all of the data analytics and recognize that and see that. And I think this speaks to both the demand and the opportunity that sits in that space. So there's no doubt in my mind that I think this will impact the multifamily space.
Yeah, the part that's interesting to me too is that it's a way to get vertically integrated as well, because of the installation arm. If you think like now, Google's been doing it sort of independent, if you would, but now they've got an army of people to actually install on that end. And so I'm curious to see what happens there.
And I think you're touching on something big, right? Is that DIY versus do it for me. I don't even know what the right acronym is, right? But this probably speaks to that also of not everybody is going to be DIY, and not everybody is going to want to put Nest in themselves. And this is a terrific opportunity for Google to align themselves with somebody like ADT to have that installation arm. And it'll be interesting to see what changes that brings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. I'd be curious to see how this rolls out. And it does have, sometimes these programs don't go anywhere. So curious to see, what happens with this one. So, well, wonderful. Well, Colin, it's been great to catch up. I look forward to episode number 2. And thanks for taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. See you in a week.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.